Hey everyone, welcome. I'm absolutely thrilled to guide you through this explainer on C++ functions today. Whether you're actively cramming for your board exams right now, or you're just kicking off your coding journey, we're going to break down everything you need to know. And we'll do it in the simplest way possible. No confusing jargon, just clear, structured concepts.
All right, here's our agenda for today. First, basics of C++ functions. Second, overloading, same name, new job. Third, setting default arguments. Fourth, making it fast, inline. And finally, number 5, we're going to test your function knowledge.
Let's dive right into Section 1, Basics of C++ Functions. So, think of a function kind of like asking your younger sibling to do a household chore. You give the task a specific name. Let's say, bring groceries. You tell them exactly what you need, and they handle all the repetitive walking and carrying for you, right? In coding, a function is literally just a named block of code that performs one particular task. It saves you from writing the exact same lines over and over again and keeps your program perfectly organized. Now, the crucial thing here is that every function relies on this three-step process. First up is the prototype, or declaration. This is where you introduce the function to the compiler. You're basically telling it the name, what it gives back, and what it needs. Second is the definition. This contains the actual step-by-step logic, the real body of the work. And third is the call, which is when you actually hit the button and tell the function to run.
Now this part is super interesting, especially if you're using older study materials. A lot of older textbooks will show you #include iostream.h and void main. But listen, programming evolves. To make sure your code actually runs on today's compilers, you have to use the modern syntax. That means #include iostream without the .h and int main. This distinction is absolutely vital for your practical exams today, so don't get caught out.
Yeah, updating your code to int main isn't just a friendly suggestion anymore, it's the strict modern requirement. The compiler expects that main function to return an integer value to the operating system, usually a 0, just to say, hey, everything ran perfectly.
All right, moving on to Section 2, overloading, same name, new job.
Function overloading is just like a versatile all-rounder in a cricket match. Depending on the situation, that one player can bat, bowl, or field. In C++, you can have multiple functions with the exact same name, like area, that do entirely different mathematical jobs depending on the arguments you pass to them. If you give it one integer, it calculates the area of a square. Give it 2 integers, it figures out a rectangle. Give it a decimal value, like a double, and boom, it calculates the area of a circle. The compiler smartly figures out which version to call based purely on the parameter list you give it.
But watch out, because here is a massive trap that students always fall into on exams. The strict rule in C++ is that the return type alone cannot overload a function. You absolutely cannot have 2 functions with the exact same name and the exact same parameters where one returns an int and one returns a double. The compiler will just get totally confused. To overload properly, the parameter list itself has to change in number, order, or type.
Let's roll into Section 3, setting default arguments. I love this concept because I like to think of it as the standard tally of programming. When you go to a restaurant and order a standard tally, you get a fixed, default set of dishes unless you specifically ask for changes, right? Default arguments work the exact same way. If you don't specifically pass a value to a function, it just uses the default. But there are strict rules here. These defaults are written in the prototype, not the definition. Also, the right-to-left rule is absolute law. Once you give a parameter a default, every single parameter to the right of it must also have a default. And no, you cannot skip a middle argument. If you want to omit arguments, they have to be trailing at the very end of your call.
As a quick side note on overloading, C++ actually lets you overload operators too. You can give operators like the plus sign or the equal sign completely new meanings for your own custom classes. However, you cannot overload certain ones, like the dot or scope resolution operators. And most importantly, and this is a classic exam question, the mathematical hierarchy or precedence never, ever changes. A multiply will always happen before an add, even if you overload them.
Okay, Section 4, making it fast, inline.
Back in the day, programmers used macros to speed up small bits of code, but macros are basically just blind copy-paste machines. If you pass an expression like ++a into a macro that squares a number, it dangerously evaluates it multiple times, which totally ruins your math. An inline function is the modern, much safer alternative. It takes the function's code and safely inserts it directly at the call site. This completely avoids the time it takes to jump to a different part of memory, all while keeping your variables totally safe from those nasty macro side effects.
But here is the crucial catch. You are only asking the compiler for a favor. Writing the word inline before your function does not force the compiler to actually do it.
At the end of the day, the compiler ultimately decides. If your function is too complex, maybe it has huge loops or complicated statements, the compiler will look at your inline request, politely ignore it, and just treat it like a normal, everyday function call. Now, before we wrap up the theory, you might see terms like static, virtual, and friend functions floating around the end of this chapter in your textbook. Don't stress about memorizing them just yet. They are advanced, class-related concepts that basically act as upcoming attractions for when we dive into object-oriented programming later on. For now, just recognize the names.
All right, it's time for Section 5, Test Your Function Knowledge.
Let's do a rapid-fire revision. Read this trick question carefully. True or false? Two functions can be overloaded if their arguments are similar but their return values are different.
That is false. As we highlighted just a minute ago, the parameter lists themselves must differ in number, order, or type. The compiler does not look at the return type to figure out which function you're trying to call.
Okay, here's another common trap regarding our standard Thali concept. True or false? If default values are mentioned for 4 arguments, we can pass the first and fourth while using defaults for the second and third.
False again. C++ strictly requires you to supply values from left to right. You can never just leave a blank space in the middle of a function call. Only the trailing arguments at the very end can be omitted to trigger those default values.
Last rapid-fire question for you. True or false? Operator precedence and hierarchy can be changed by overloading. So if you give the plus sign a brand new meaning, does its mathematical hierarchy change?
Absolutely false. Precedence is fixed and stays exactly the same no matter how much you overload it. Well, I really hope this explainer made the fundamental rules of C++ functions crystal clear for you today. We've covered prototypes, modern syntax, overloading, and default arguments. So I want to leave you with this final thought for your own programming journey. Now that you know these rules, are you just writing code that barely works? Or are you ready to use these tools to write code that is truly elegant and efficient? Keep practicing, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.